skills, be the boss. No more time to feel lost. Lead the way every day. Find success, it's here to stay. Rise and shine, it's your time. Skill up, raise the climb. Navigate, innovate. It's your fate, don't be late. Get the skills, be the boss. No more time to feel lost. Lead the way every day. Find success, it's here to stay.
If you're a new manager or hoping to be a new manager, join us in our exploration into what managers need to know. This program will set you up for success by building your knowledge and confidence in the skills you need to be effective. Welcome to What Managers Need to Know About Problem Solving, and we're going to have a 5-section series on how to solve problems and make decisions. If you're not familiar with me, I taught for the Executive Management Institute and the Small Business Development Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Business for 30 years as an adjunct professor. I've been a workplace learning and performance improvement consultant with my own business for over 35 years. So we're going to look at problem solving and decision making, beginning with defining the problem, identifying the decision making criteria that we'll use to solve that problem, developing alternatives, making a decision, and then planning how to implement it. So, how many of you have ever solved a problem and made things worse? Probably most of us have done that. We've jumped ahead, we've made an assumption, and what we've done is not solve the problem, but probably added to the problem. So welcome. We want to avoid that, and we're to look at ways to do that today. So defining the problem. There's a 5-step rational problem-solving process. We are not going to look at an irrational one. And these 5 steps inform the steps that we're going to be looking at in the next 5 weeks. Step 1, define the problem. Step 2, identify decision-making criteria. Step 3, develop alternatives. And these are solution alternatives. Step 4, make a decision. And then step 5, plan how to implement the decision. Because there's nothing worse than going through this whole process and then letting things die. Or going through the process and having those who are responsible for implementing the decision choosing not to do that. Let's move it along. Okay. So there are 2 problem-solving rules. First, the obvious problem is rarely the problem. And second, the obvious solution is rarely the solution. And there are common reasons why solutions to problems are ineffective. They address symptoms rather than the real problem. They are based on insufficient or inaccurate information, sometimes because we've rushed to a decision without getting all the facts. They are made for subjective rather than objective reasons. They are made for the sake of expediency. They fix only one part of a larger problem. They are based on the wrong root cause. And we're going to look at different ways to find the root cause. They're unrealistic. They are the wrong solution for the real problem. They do not consider all contributing factors. They are beyond the scope of those who have to implement them. They solve the wrong problem, and they are based on assumptions. So we're going to look at 4 cause analysis techniques which help us define the problem. We're going to look at an is not matrix, the cause and effect diagram, otherwise known as the fishbone, the top-down flow chart, and 5 whys, which you may be familiar with. First, just a brief description of these, and then we'll go into them in more detail. The is not matrix pinpoints when and where a problem exists and where it doesn't exist. It's helpful where there's a sense that a problem is all-encompassing, when in fact it might be localized and easier to solve if we could just pinpoint where that is. The cause and effect diagram, often referred to as the fishbone because it looks like a fishbone, identifies and organizes possible causes of a problem. It's helpful when there's a sense that the problem is very general, which makes it difficult to determine how to approach a solution. The top-down flow chart identifies the major sequential steps in a process. This helps us determine which step may have been overlooked, resulting in the problem. And sometimes it's more than one step that has been overlooked. It's helpful when the problem appears to be the result of a process. And the 5 whys, they identify the root cause of a problem by repeatedly asking why until the underlying issue becomes clear. And hopefully in 5 iterations, we identify what that real problem is. It's helpful when there's a need to quickly analyze straightforward problems or recurring issues to prevent them from happening again, especially in quality and process improvement contexts. So a closer look. The is not matrix. It defines when and where the problem occurs, assuming it didn't occur at the time, all the time, and everywhere. It's a good technique to pinpoint a problem by exposing when it does and does not occur. The matrix questions help to organize existing knowledge and information about the problem. Using this technique first to identify the problem can help form additional problem analysis. So, for example, the problem is initially defined as not enough time to do what needs to be done. The obvious solution might be to hire more staff. In order to further define the problem, however, we have to find out when the problem exists and when it does not exist. So I'm hoping you can see this. It asks who is involved. It's X, Y, and Z staff. It's not all staff, and therefore we can conclude only X, Y, and Z are affected. When it occurs, certain times of the month, right after staff's turnover, and when staff is not trained to implement new procedures. It is not all the time, it's not when fully staffed, and it's not when procedures are already in place. So therefore, we can conclude it happens only certain times and only when changes are involved. Where does it occur? Certain sections, certain units and departments. It's not everywhere. Therefore, we can conclude that staff assistance may be available from other sections or units or departments. How it occurs: staff get overworked, staff get stressed. It's not that work is left undone. So staff is able to generate the work at the expense of health and overtime. Going back here for a minute. So we know that there's a problem. The staff is rising to the challenge, but with severe consequences in terms of their health and cost of overtime. So because it isn't happening everywhere, we could reassign other staff to fill in at these critical times and help alleviate the burden on the other staff. A closer look at the cause and effect diagram. It identifies and organizes the possible causes of the problem or factors needed to address it. It's most effective after the problem has been defined, although the problem that is initially identified is frequently revisited after the contributing branches are discussed. The diagram provides a pictorial display of a list and shows the relationships between the factors. And it's also very useful in brainstorming because it makes you want to come up with enough branches so that it looks balanced. So the example is initially defined as stress on the job, which is an enormous issue. It's hard to grab hold of where to deal with it. So without further information, it's difficult to identify solutions to minimize the stress. In order to further define the problem, we have to identify what contributes to the problem and what is within our span of control, which would be part of a decision-making criteria. So here we have the fishbone, or the the cause and effect diagram. We have stress. Can I show this? I don't know. Here we are. We have stress. And we have 4 huge contributing axes here. Fear of failure, because mistakes are criticized in public, people are perfectionists, mistakes are costly. Lack of support, there's insufficient resources, there's lack of authority, they're not able to make decisions. Insufficient staff. There's discomfort with change, there's too many changes, there's an unrealistic implementation time, there's conflicting changes. And then there's poor communication. People are unaware of the reasons for the change. They have a lack of advance warning of the changes in priorities. There are unclear expectations and limited feedback. So we could explore all of these. Get back to my place here. For example, we may decide based on the contributing branches that the stress is too general, that possibly poor communication is a better statement of the problem. Then we can assess which contributing factors are most important and over which we have some control, such as unclear expectations and limited feedback. And then we can work on improving those areas. A closer look at the top-down flowchart. The technique provides a picture of the major sequential steps in a process. It enforces logical thinking to identify the major steps necessary to accomplish a goal. The chart can then be analyzed to determine if there are steps that were overlooked that therefore resulted in the problem under investigation. For example, the problem is initially defined as poorly trained staff. In order to further define the problem, we need to identify the steps and sub-steps that would logically be involved in planning and implementing the change that the staff are expected to implement. So we have 5 steps here. Step 1 is identify the desired change. We assess the situation, define the problem, identify alternatives, assess the alternatives, decide to make a change. There's the rational problem-solving model right there. Step 2 is once we have decided to make a change, we need to identify the implementation needs, analyze the change, identify the impact of the change, determine needed resources to implement the change. Step 3 is assess the available resources. Investigate the resources, identify available resources, evaluate them, identify gaps, and specify additional resource needs. Develop an implementation plan. Identify the steps to make the change, define the timeline, specify task assignments, develop a budget, and define controls. And then finally, step 5, implement and monitor the plan. Implement the plan, implement controls, assess progress, identify problems, analyze problems, solve problems, monitor activities. Well, I don't know if you can see it clearly, but under step 2, number 3, sub 3, determine needed resources to implement. Everything under step 3, assess the available resources. And under step 4, number 1, identify steps to make the change, are all in italicized print. And that's because they were overlooked. It appears that the organization jumped from step 1 to step 5. It's going to have to go back and do steps 2, 3, and 4. Without this information, the solution might be to blame and train staff again, which will not solve the real problem, the lack of systems to support the desired changes. And this happened with a bank that I was working with, where the central bank made decision in terms of how deposits were handled. They didn't bother to teach the branch staff. The branch staff were hysterical because they were entering deposits and they had no idea where it was going. Central staff blamed the branch staff for being incompetent. But the real issue was that the branch staff were never trained. They were never told about the change, and they never were walked through what would happen with a deposit under the change. A closer look at the 5 whys. This technique is a quick way to get to the root problem. It forces continually deeper thinking, moving past assumptions to basic facts. For example, the problem is initially defined as poorly trained staff. That's the presenting problem. So why? They don't know what to do. Why? No one told them. Why? There wasn't a training plan. Why? We went right to implementation. Why? We didn't want to take time to think through what staff would need. We just wanted to get on with the change and move on past it. Let's talk. If you would like help defining problems using these techniques, schedule time to talk with me using the URL code or the QR code. Next week, now that we have defined the problem, we're going to identify decision-making criteria, and we want to do this before we get to us identifying and assessing solutions. Otherwise, we may come up with a solution that is not possible, is not plausible under the circumstances. So we need those decision-making criteria at the very beginning of the process. Thank you for sharing your time with me. I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much for coming and participating in our discussion of what managers need to know. You can find the videos of this and previous sessions on my YouTube channel or under events on my LinkedIn profile. I'll look forward to seeing you again next week.
Get the skills, be the boss, no more time to feel lost. Lead the way, every day, find success, it's here to stay. Get the skills, be the boss, no more time to feel lost. Lead the way, every day, find success, it's here to stay. It's here to stay. Oh, it's here to stay. It's here to stay. Yeah. Get the skills, be the boss, no more time to feel lost.